The summer, the drought came for real, not the kind people complained about over coffee, but the kind that cracked the skin on the back of your hands and turned good pasture land into something you could sweep. I was riding fence line on my uncle's property, which butted up against the Vasquez spread on the eastern edge. My name is Calvin Reed. I kept a journal, which my uncle thought was the most useless habit a man could have out here, second only to, as he put it, trusting weather forecasts and women who smile too easy. He wasn't a mean man, my uncle. He was just a man shaped entirely by what had already hurt him, which is a specific kind of meanness that doesn't know itself. I wrote things down because I was 26 years old and new to this country and terrified of forgetting what I was learning. Not facts, impressions. The way the light hit a dust devil in late afternoon. The way a horse smelled when it was scared. I wrote down the names of people I met and small details about them, things I thought might matter later and couldn't yet say why. I wrote down Nora Vasquez on a Tuesday in early May. She was arguing with a man from the county water board. I couldn't hear the conversation clearly. I was maybe 40 yards off on the other side of a barbed wire fence pretending to check a loose post while I actually just watched, but I could read the shape of it. He had a clipboard. She had her arms crossed. He kept gesturing toward a form on the clipboard. She kept shaking her head. What I wrote down that evening was this: Vasquez woman. Late 40s maybe, calloused hands, doesn't flinch when she disagrees. The county man left looking embarrassed. She watched him drive away like she was memorizing his license plate number just in case. I had no idea writing that, what I was actually watching. The drought announcement came officially in June, though anyone who paid attention to soil rather than radio knew it had been building since February. The snowpack in the mountains had been thin. The spring runoff had been a trickle where it should have been a rush. The aquifer levels were already down, and the water board was preparing tiered restrictions, which in practical terms meant the big operations would get proportional cuts, and the small ones would get cut in a way that sounded fair and wasn't. My uncle understood this immediately and bitterly. He started calculating what to sell, what to cull, which fields to fallow, and which to fight for. He was a practical man in the way that people who have lost before are always practical. He already knew where the hits were coming, and he was arranging himself to absorb them. The Harmon brothers, who ran the largest cattle spread in the valley, put in for emergency ground permits and hired a drilling company out of Albuquerque. They were going to sink 3 new wells, deep ones, drawing from the lower aquifer. Legal, technically, smart. The county engineers said it was sustainable. I wrote down that evening, nobody asks what sustainable means to the water itself. And Nora Vasquez started digging by hand. Not entirely by hand. She had a mechanical auger, an old one she'd apparently bought from an estate sale somewhere. I heard this from my uncle, who heard it from someone at the feed store, the kind of rig you mount on a tractor's 3-point hitch, designed for fence post holes but jury-rigged, with some modification I never fully understood, to drill deeper. She was working a section of her back pasture that nobody had worked in years, a rocky slope that ran down toward a shallow arroyo. I first saw the operation on a morning in mid-June when I was riding the fence line again. She had the tractor idling, the auger turning slow, and she was kneeling in the dirt looking at something she'd pulled up core samples. I realized later, though at the time I just saw a woman crouching in the dust staring at rocks. 3 men from the neighboring spread, the picket lease, boys who'd been in the valley their whole lives, were watching from their truck, pulled up on the county road that ran along the ridge above her property. I could hear them from where I was. Their voices carried in that flat, dry air. "She drilling for oil," one of them said. "Drilling for crazy is more like it." Laughter, that particular laughter. She didn't look up. I wrote that down. I didn't know why at the time. It just seemed important. The thing about Nora Vasquez that I began to understand only gradually, the way you understand a landscape better the longer you ride through it, was that she wasn't acting on a hunch. She was acting on something more uncomfortable than a hunch. She was acting on knowledge that other people had decided not to believe. Her father had homesteaded this land in the 50s. Her grandfather before him had worked it as a hired hand and then scraped together enough to buy the eastern parcel after the war. 3 generations on this same piece of ground. And her grandmother, a woman named Esperanza, whose photograph sat on the windowsill of Nora's kitchen in a cracked frame, which I would see only much later, had talked about water. Not the creek, Not the irrigation ditch that ran along the north edge of the property, the one everyone depended on, but other water, hidden water. Water that sat in pockets in the limestone below the arroyo, that surfaced as seeps in wet years and went silent in dry ones, but never, her grandmother had insisted, never went entirely away. Nobody had believed Esperanza either. There was a hydrologist, a woman who worked for the state university and sometimes consulted for small agricultural operations, who had come out to the Vasquez property 3 years earlier during a normal cycle, not drought, not crisis, just a routine dry spell. She'd done ground-penetrating surveys. She'd said there were indications of a fractured limestone pocket beneath the arroyo slope, the kind that in the right geological circumstance could hold perched groundwater independent of the main aquifer. She'd said, "It might be nothing. It might be something." She'd said, "The data suggests it's worth drilling a test bore." The county had said, "We don't fund speculative drilling." The bank had said, "We don't loan against speculative geology reports." The Harmon brothers had laughed when they heard about it at the co-op. One of them had said something about old Mexican well-witching stories that I don't want to write down even now, because it was ugly, and because it was the kind of thing people say when they need the person they're dismissing to fail. Nora had saved for 2 years and bought the auger rig. I'm going to tell you something about this land in drought that I couldn't have understood before I lived through it. It isn't just that things die. It's that the dying happens in a particular order, and watching that order is its own education in what actually matters and what only seemed to. The ornamental stuff goes first. The flower beds that ranchers' wives tend in good years, the vegetable gardens, the young trees that haven't rooted deep enough to argue with the sky. Then the pasture grasses. Not all at once, but in patches. The south-facing slopes go first, then the flats, then the north-facing spots hold on the longest because they get a little more shade, a little less evaporation. Then the creek starts to drop. Then the irrigation ditch delivers less than it promises. Then the cattle start to lose weight, and you can see it in their hip bones, and every morning the rancher walks out and does the calculation in his head. How many more days can I carry them? And against that, what's the cost of selling them now versus the cost of losing them later? My uncle culled 8 cows from his herd in June. He didn't talk about it. He came in for dinner and ate quietly and went to bed early, and I could hear the TV in his room. He never watched TV going until after midnight. The picket boys were grazing their lease cattle on stubble. They were rotating them through fields that had already been grazed down, trying to get a second pass out of grass that had nothing left to give. The Harmon operation hired 2 extra hands to haul water by truck to their farthest pastures. And Nora Vasquez was 30 feet down into her limestone slope, pulling core samples, and the drill was bringing up rock that her hydrologist friend, who had driven out on her own time on a weekend without billing for it, said was showing moisture. Not water, moisture, the hair-thin presence of something that might be there. Might. I wrote that word down and underlined it twice. I should tell you about the evening I first actually spoke to her, rather than just watched her from across a fence line like a man with a notebook and too much time. It was late June. The thermometer on my uncle's barn had read 104 at 3 in the afternoon, and even at 7 in the evening it was still 91, still, without a breath of wind. I'd been checking the water line that ran along the shared fence, my uncle's property, her property, 160 yards of galvanized pipe that fed a stock tank they'd had a cost-sharing arrangement on for as long as anyone could remember. The line had dropped to a trickle. I found the problem at the junction box, a fitting that had cracked in the heat. Fixable, but not that evening. I was crouching in the dirt trying to figure out if I could rig something temporary when I heard boots on the dry ground and looked up, and there she was. She was taller than I'd registered from a distance. She had black hair going gray at the temples, pulled back with a strip of leather, and the kind of face that had decided something long ago and hadn't reopened the question. Not hard, resolved. There's a difference. She looked at the fitting, she looked at me. "Calvin Reed," I said. "My uncle's the—" "I know who you are," she said, not unkind, just already past that part. She crouched down next to me and looked at the fitting with the professional assessment of someone who'd fixed approximately everything on this property with her own hands at some point. She said, "I've got a 2-inch compression coupling that'll hold until you can get the right fitting. Different size, but it'll close the gap." She went back to her barn and came back in 4 minutes with the coupling and a pair of channel lock pliers. She handed them to me and crouched again and watched me work. "You're drilling back in the 40, I said, because I needed to say something. "Yes. People are saying." "I know what people are saying." A pause. "You keep a journal." I stopped and looked at her. "I see you writing in it," she said, not looking at me, watching the fitting. "When you're riding the fence, you pull it out of your saddlebag and write things down." "Habit," I said. "Write down what you actually see," she said, "not what sounds right." I didn't know what to say to that. I tightened the coupling. The flow returned, thinner than it should have been, but there. She stood up, brushed the dust off her knees, and said, "I'm at 40 feet. The moisture content in the core is increasing. My grandmother was right. I don't know by how much yet, but she was right." She said it the way you say something you've needed to say to someone for a long time, and finally found the right person to say it to, even if that person is just some young man with a journal crouched over a broken pipe fitting at 7 in the evening. Then she walked back toward her property. I wrote that down that night, the whole of it, and when I read it back, I wrote one more line at the bottom. She's not drilling for water. She's drilling to prove something that her grandmother already knew, and that the proof matters to her as much as the water does. I was right, I was also wrong. It was more complicated than that. They always are. By the 1st of July, she was at 62 feet. I knew this because I'd started making small excuses to ride the fence line more often. I was honest enough with myself to admit, in the journal, that I was following the story. I told myself it was observation. It was partly that. It was also that I had not in my life seen someone do something this specific kind of difficult without either giving up or becoming someone else in order to endure it, and I wanted to know how she was doing it. The auger had hit a band of harder rock at 45 feet, and she'd had to reconfigure the drill head twice. The first reconfiguration she did herself, with reference to a manual she'd downloaded and printed in chunks at the library in town. The second one she'd had to call the hydrologist, who'd driven out again on her own time, and they'd spent an afternoon reconfiguring together. The tractor's hydraulics were running hot. She'd noticed it and reduced her drilling sessions to the cooler parts of the morning and evening, which meant the progress was slower. She was also still running her farm, the goats, the kitchen garden, which she was watering by hand with water she was hauling from the remaining creek flow in a flatbed tank on the back of her truck. 50 gallons at a time, 2 trips a morning, because she refused to let the garden die even as she was spending every other hour trying to find the water that would save everything. She was running on, I estimated from the outside, about 5 hours of sleep. I wrote, she's not just tired. She's the kind of tired that becomes a physical location you're living inside of. The kind where you stop feeling your hands until you look down at them. She never showed it when she was outside. This is the thing that nobody watching from the road could see. She showed it at the edges, a slightly longer pause before she got back on the tractor. A moment at the fence line in the early evening, when she just stood and looked at the arroyo and didn't move for a long time. I saw that once. I didn't write it down. It felt like something she hadn't meant for anyone to see, and I was writing this in the margin of that journal page later, to be a witness, not a surveiller. I wasn't always sure I was succeeding. On the 8th of July, at 67 feet, the auger came up wet. Not damp, not hopeful, wet. I wasn't there for the moment itself. I heard it from my uncle, who heard it from someone at the co-op who'd heard it from the hydrologist, who had apparently let out a sound that she later described as not entirely professional when she saw the core. Water, real water. Sitting in a fractured limestone pocket at depth, held there by an impermeable clay layer below it, perched and preserved and waiting. Independent of the main aquifer, not affected by the surface drought, not part of the drawdown the Harmon wells were already beginning to cause. Esperanza's water. I rode the fence line the next morning, and she was already working on the casing. She looked the same as she always looked, which is to say, she looked like someone who had been right about something for a very long time and hadn't needed the proof to already live as if she was right. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different. Looser, just a degree, the held tension of a years-long argument finally, quietly over. She looked up when she heard my horse and said, 67 feet. I heard, I said. Water table will need testing before we start pulling from it. Mineral content, flow rate, recovery rate. Could be 2 weeks before we know how much we actually have. But it's there. It was always there, she said. My grandmother said so. She went back to work. I sat on my horse a moment longer. Then I pulled out my journal and I wrote, July 9, she found it. Or rather, she found what was already there. There's a difference. I'm still working out what it is. The next 2 weeks were their own kind of suspense. The test results took time. The flow rate measurements took time. The mineral analysis, done at a university lab, not the county's, because she didn't trust the counties not to find a reason to complicate her permit, took time. And during those 2 weeks, the drought got worse. The creek dropped to a series of disconnected pools. The irrigation ditch went to ration delivery, every third day for the small operations, every other day for the larger ones. The Harmon wells were pulling hard, and the water table around their spread started showing effects. Other wells in the area dropping, flow rates declining, the kind of thing the engineers said wasn't their doing, and that everyone who knew anything about hydrogeology knew perfectly well was. My uncle sold 6 more cows. He didn't go to bed early this time. He sat at the kitchen table after dinner and did the math out loud, and I sat across from him and listened, because there wasn't anything useful to say, and I'd learned by then that sometimes the right thing was just to be present for the accounting. The picket boys were talking about abandoning the lease. They couldn't afford the water hauling. Their cattle were showing stress. And Nora Vasquez was watering her kitchen garden by hand, waiting for test results, not telling anyone yet what she'd found. That last part I didn't understand until she explained it later. She said, I needed to know what I had before anyone else tried to have an opinion about it. The results came back on the 22nd of July. I know the date because she came to find me, specifically, at my uncle's barn. The only time she'd ever sought me out rather than the other way around. And she handed me a folded paper that was the lab summary. Flow rate, sustainable draw of 11 gallons per minute, with full recovery over 18 hours. Mineral content, clean, potable with standard treatment. Volume estimate. Conservative modeling suggested the pocket held enough to sustain her current operation for 7 to 10 years at that draw rate, assuming normal precipitation patterns resumed at some point in that window. 7 to 10 years, she said, watching my face as I read it. Yes. The thing is, and I wrote about this at length because it mattered, she didn't look triumphant. She looked like a person who had completed a very long piece of work and was now standing in the strange open space on the other side of it, not sure yet what to feel. Vindication is not the same as joy. They occupy different rooms. She said, I need to file the permits and set up the pump system. 6-8 weeks before I'm drawing from it at any real volume. The cistern is a holding measure in the meantime. The cistern, the thing I hadn't fully understood yet, that I'd thought was the whole story, was actually only the infrastructure. She'd spent the previous month, in the hours she wasn't drilling, building a buried cistern, a concrete-lined holding tank, hand-formed, sunk into the hillside, to receive and store whatever the test pump pulled while she waited for the formal permits. She'd done most of it herself, some of it with the hydrologist, none of it visible from the road. A hidden cistern, the thing they'd laughed at. Why hidden, I asked. She looked at me for a moment like she was deciding how honest to be. Then she said, because if they could see it, they would have found a way to stop it before I knew if it worked. I wrote that down that night, word for word. The permits took 9 days, not the 6 to 8 weeks Nora had estimated, though not for reasons anyone expected. The County Water Board, which had been largely invisible through the summer, became very interested in the Vasquez property very quickly once word got out. I say once word got out, and I mean, once the Harmon brothers heard about it. I don't know exactly how they heard. These valleys have their own information systems, as old and reliable as weather. What I know is that on the morning of July 24th, 2 days after Nora showed me the test results, there was a county truck parked on the road above her property. She saw it before I did. I was riding out, and she was already standing at her fence line, watching it, and her expression was the particular kind of stillness that isn't calm. It's the stillness of someone who expected exactly this and had been ready for it for a long time. Inspector, she said when I came up alongside the fence. She didn't look at me. Water board, they'll want to see the test bore, the cistern, the pump setup, all of it. Can they stop it? They can try to condition it, impose restrictions, delay the operational permit while they do additional review. A pause. There is a provision in the county code, I looked it up 3 years ago, that allows them to require an environmental impact assessment on new groundwater extraction if they believe there's potential for aquifer interference. That assessment takes 4 to 6 months. But your water is perched, independent of the main aquifer. Yes, she finally looked at me. That's the argument, and it's the correct argument. Whether it's the argument that wins is a different matter. I wrote that night. She knew this was coming. She prepared for the drilling, she prepared for the failure, and she prepared for the success too, including the part where success makes new enemies. What I cannot figure out is when she had time to be afraid. The inspector's name was Garland. He was a polite man, thorough, with the manner of someone who genuinely cared about doing his job correctly and also understood that his job existed within a structure of interests that was not always aligned with correctness. He spent 4 hours on the property. He reviewed the board documentation, the pump test data, the hydrologist's reports, the lab results. At the end of it, he sat at Nora's kitchen table. I knew this because she told me that evening at the fence line in the last light, and he put down the papers and he said, "Mrs. Vasquez, the data here is clear. This is a perched pocket, hydrologically isolated from the primary formation. The impact assessment provision doesn't apply. I'm going to say that in my report." She'd waited. He'd said, "I need you to understand that my report goes to the board, and the board makes the final determination, and the board is made up of people." "Yes," she said. "People with interests." "Yes," she said again. He'd looked at the photograph of Esperanza on the windowsill, the cracked frame, the woman who'd said water and not been believed. He'd picked up his papers and stood up. "I'll have the report in within 48 hours, he said. "My recommendation will be for immediate operational permitting." She'd said thank you, he'd said don't thank me yet, he'd driven away. She told me all of this at the fence line in the last light, standing with her forearms on the top wire, looking toward the arroyo. She wasn't telling me because she needed comfort. I understood that. She was telling me because she was recording it somehow, by saying it out loud, in the way that people who have been through something unwitnessed feel the need to give it a witness after the fact. I was learning to be useful in that specific way. The board met on the 31st of July. I did not go. Nora went with the hydrologist and with a folder of documentation that she'd organized with a thoroughness that would have impressed a federal attorney. She'd also brought, at the hydrologist's suggestion, printed copies of the aquifer impact data for the Harmon wells, the decline in neighboring water table levels that could be attributed to their draws, not to make an accusation, but, as the hydrologist put it, to establish context. The board meeting was in the county building in town. It lasted 3 hours. I know what happened in it because Nora gave me a summary that evening, standing at the fence, and because I also happened to be in town for a parts run, and I walked past the county building twice, and both times there were 2 of the Harmon brothers in the parking lot, waiting. Not inside. Outside. The specific positioning of men who want to demonstrate presence without appearing to be there officially. I wrote that down. What happened in the board meeting? The county attorney raised the environmental impact provision. Nora's hydrologist dismantled it on geological grounds, citing the perched aquifer classification, the clay impermeable layer, the pump test recovery data, the draw to formation size ratio. It took 40 minutes. It was airtight. The county attorney then raised a secondary concern: historical water rights. Did the Vasquez property have a recorded water right that would cover this new source? Nora's folder contained, among other things, a copy of the original Homestead Water Decree from 1952, her grandfather's name on it, which the Water Board's own records confirmed included rights to all groundwater sources naturally occurring beneath the described parcel. That language had been standard in homestead decrees of that era and had never been challenged, because nobody had ever thought it would matter. It mattered. The board voted 3-2 for immediate operational permitting. She called me from the parking lot. This was the only time she ever called me. I didn't know she had my number until the phone rang, and she said, 3-2. 3-2, I said. There was a silence that wasn't empty. Get the pump running, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. Already planning it, she said. and the line went quiet. She pulled first water from the cistern on August 3rd. I was there. I'd asked if I could be, and she'd said yes in a way that suggested she'd been about to ask me and had been waiting to see if I'd ask first. The hydrologist was there too, and a younger woman who was Nora's daughter, visiting from Albuquerque. I hadn't known she had a daughter, who stood with her arms wrapped around herself, and watched with an expression I recognized as the expression of someone who has been told about something their whole life and is now watching it be real. The pump was a small electric submersible, nothing dramatic. The pipe rose from the casing, ran along the hillside to the cistern, and then down from the cistern via gravity feed to a distribution header that Nora had laid along the main field borders. She threw the breaker. The pump started. There was a sound, a low mechanical hum that you felt as much as heard. And then, after maybe 2 minutes, long enough for the water to travel the line, there was a sound at the distribution header that was the sound of water moving under pressure. Real pressure. Not hauled water, not gravity-trickled water from a dying creek, but water drawn from rock that had been holding it safe for longer than anyone's grandmother had been alive. Nora's daughter made a sound I won't try to describe. Nora herself walked to the header and put her hand on the pipe, just laid her palm against it. She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and her hand on the pipe, feeling the water moving through it. Then she opened her eyes and said, to no one in particular, "All right. Let's run the lines." I wrote that night a long entry, longer than most, and at the end of it I wrote, "She put her hand on the pipe like you'd put your hand on a person's shoulder. Like the water was a living thing she was greeting, like it had been waiting for her as much as she'd been waiting for it." I crossed that out. It was too much. But then I left the crossing out there on the page so you could see I'd thought it and decided not to say it and still wanted it to be known. August is when the valley began to understand what it was looking at. The Vasquez fields didn't bloom overnight. It wasn't that kind of water, and it wasn't that kind of story. What happened was slower and more verifiable. The pasture grass that had been yellowing began, in patches, to stop yellowing. The kitchen garden stopped dying and began, tentatively, to recover. The goats, which had been losing condition, began to stabilize. Small things. The kind of things that anyone paying attention could see and anyone who wasn't would miss. People were paying attention. The picket boys drove past her property 3 times in 2 days. I saw them. The 3rd time one of them stopped his truck on the road for a long moment looking at the fields before driving on. I didn't wave. He didn't wave. He was doing the math, and the math was doing something to him that showed in the way he sat behind the wheel. My uncle noticed. He noticed the way older men who have been on a piece of land for a long time notice things, not with surprise, but with a kind of deliberate neutrality that is actually its own form of being moved. He said at dinner, not looking up from his plate, "Vasquez woman's fields are holding." "Yes," I said. He ate in silence for a while. Then he said, "Her grandmother used to say there was water under that arroyo." I looked up. "Esperanza," he said it to anyone who'd listen for years. He ate another bite. We didn't. He didn't say anything after that, and I didn't push. I wrote it down later. My uncle said, "We didn't the way you say something that you've known was true for a long time, and that you're finally putting down because carrying it has gotten too heavy." The first person to ask her for help was not who I expected. It was Garland, the inspector. He came out to the property on a Saturday, not in a county truck, but in his own pickup, a personal visit, and he stood at her gate with his hat in his hands and said he had a cousin who had a small spread about 12 miles east, and the cousin's well was going dry, and he was wondering, not officially, not as a county matter, just as a man asking a neighbor, whether Nora knew anyone who could do a ground survey. He meant the hydrologist. Nora said yes. She picked up her phone and called the hydrologist right there at the gate, with Garland standing there hat in hand, and she arranged for a survey visit for the following week. Garland said thank you. He said he was sorry it had taken the board so long. He said he was sorry about the board at all, which was as close as he could come, as a county employee, to saying what he actually meant. Nora said, "Tell your cousin the survey is already paid for." He looked at her. "I paid for mine out of pocket," she said. "I'll pay for his." She turned and walked back toward the barn. I was there for this. I was leaning on the fence pretending to check a staple. I watched Garland put his hat back on, and I watched him stand there for a moment after she'd gone, and I could see him recalibrating something. The way you recalibrate when someone behaves in a way that you had not predicted based on the category you'd put them in. I wrote, she's not doing it to be generous. She's doing it because she understands now that the water being there doesn't help anything if she's the only one who knows how to find it. Esperanza told anyone who'd listen. Nora's going to make sure someone actually listens. The harder conversation, harder than the board meeting, harder than the permits, harder in a way that didn't resolve into a clear outcome, happened on August 9th. One of the Harmon brothers, not in a truck on the road above her property. He came to her front door. His name was Dale, the younger one, the one who'd made the well-witching comment at the co-op. He was 50-something, big man going soft around the middle, wearing a clean shirt that suggested he'd put thought into this visit. She told me about it the same evening, at the fence line, same as always. He'd asked about water, not for himself. The Harmon wells were still running, still drawing down the local table, still legal, but for one of their lease families. A family who worked a small parcel on the Harmon lease, a couple with 2 kids whose domestic well had gone to sulfur and clay in the drawdown. They'd been hauling drinking water by truck for 2 weeks. The kids were 8 and 11. He'd come to ask if Nora could supply them, even just for drinking and cooking. He'd pay whatever she thought was fair. She'd been quiet for a long time after he explained this, long enough that he'd shifted his weight twice and looked at his boots once. Then she'd said the kids' names. He'd said Rosalie. And Marcus. She'd said all right, and then no charge, tell them to bring their tank truck Tuesday morning. He'd started to say something about payment, and she'd said, the water didn't cost me anything, it was already there. Which wasn't quite literally true, and was exactly true in the way that mattered. She told me all this, and then was quiet. He's one of the ones who laughed, I said. Yes, she said. Does that bother you? A pause, the dry evening air moving dust somewhere below us in the arroyo. It would bother me more, she said, to let 2 kids drink sulfur water because of how I feel about their boss. I didn't write anything that night, I just sat with it. Late August in the valley has a particular character. The heat is the same as July, maybe worse, but it sits differently. It has the weight of permanence, the sense that this is what the world has decided to be, and accommodation is no longer optional. You either find a way to exist inside it or you don't. I had been in the valley for 4 months. I had filled 112 pages of my journal. I had watched a woman find water in rock that everyone said was dry, defend it in a room full of people who wanted to complicate it, and begin to distribute what she'd found to people who needed it before she'd finished distributing it to herself. I was also watching something else, something I hadn't known to look for and wouldn't have known to name until I saw it. I was watching a valley reconfigure its understanding of what was possible. This is not a dramatic thing from the outside. It looks like small conversations at the feed store. It looks like someone driving past a green field and driving more slowly than they used to. It looks like a woman at the hardware store asking questions about auger rigs that she would not have asked 3 months ago. It is the smallest adjustments, and it is the accumulation of small adjustments into something that will matter for the next 30 years, and it is almost entirely invisible while it's happening. I wrote about it at length and then doubted what I'd written, because it felt like I was making it larger than it was. Then I wrote, maybe the opposite is true. Maybe I'm not making it large enough because I don't have the language yet for how quietly enormous it is. I need to tell you about Nora's daughter, whose name was Claudia, and who stayed 3 weeks instead of the 4 days she'd planned. Claudia was 31. She worked in water resource management for a state agency in Albuquerque. This, I would learn later, was not coincidence, though I didn't know about it yet. She had her mother's way of standing, the shoulders back, feet planted stance of someone who has spent time on land and carries that in the body even in cities. She had opinions, and she had the habit of stating them directly, which sometimes looked like impatience and was actually just efficiency. She had watched her mother drill for 2 years by ear, getting updates by phone, coming out twice to help with the physical work, being present for the practical without being present for the daily accumulation of it. And she arrived on the 3rd of August, the day the pump first ran, with the expression of someone who had not quite let herself believe until she could see it. I talked to her at the fence line on her 4th morning there, while her mother was running water lines to the south pasture. Claudia came and stood next to me and watched her mother work for a while. She said she called me the night she found the hydrologist's report, 3 years ago. She was excited, not the way she lets herself be excited in front of people, but the other way, the private way, and she said, "Claudia, the water's there, I know it's there." And I said, "Mom, the county won't fund the drilling." And she said, "I know that." A pause, her mother, far across the field, adjusted a fitting and moved on. "She didn't ask me for money," Claudia said. "I keep thinking about that. She never asked me for money, She stopped. "Just told you," I said. "Just told me, and then spent 2 years saving for an auger rig." I wrote that down later, the whole of it. I wrote, "Claudia needed to say this out loud for the same reason Nora told me about the board meeting at the fence line. Some things only become real when someone else knows them." Testimony as completion. On the 12th of August, the first family that Dale Harmon had sent, not the Lease family with the kids, they'd been coming since Tuesday, but another family, a retired couple named the Fenwicks who lived on the Eastern Road and whose shallow well had gone to nothing, came to the property. Nora showed them where to fill. She showed them the flow rate, the expected recovery time, what they could draw per visit without stressing the pocket. She was methodical about it and specific, because she'd thought it through and had a number in her head. Sustainable distribution at 11 gallons per minute with an 18-hour recovery meant she could support 4 external families in addition to her own operation, if everyone managed their draws carefully. She told this to the Fenwicks, and to the Lease family, and eventually to 2 other small operations who came to her, quietly, not through any announcement, but through the specific grapevine that operates in a community when something real is happening, and people are trying to access it without making a formal thing of it. 4 families, her operation sustainable. She had done the math before any of them arrived. She'd done it in the margin of a legal pad I saw on her kitchen table once, a long column of numbers with the final figure circled twice. Claudia and I had dinner at the kitchen table on the 15th of August, the 3 of us, which was the first time I'd been inside the house for any extended period. The photograph of Esperanza was on the windowsill, the cracked frame, the woman who'd said water in a valley that hadn't believed her. I asked Nora about her grandmother directly, because I'd earned the right to ask it by then. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, she came from a place in Chihuahua where water was the entire logic of survival, where you read the land for water the way other people read weather. She came here and she read this land and she said, "There's water below the arroyo," and she said it for 30 years, and nobody believed her. She set her fork down. She died believing it was true. She never had the equipment to prove it. Claudia was looking at the photograph. "What would she think," I said, "about all of this? The permits, the drilling, the pump." Nora looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was. "She'd think it took too long," she said. And then she'd say, "But it happened," and she'd mean that in the largest possible way. Claudia said quietly, she'd think the cistern was a good idea. Nora looked at her daughter, and something passed between them that I knew better than to try to write down. Some things exist outside of language, and the obligation of a witness is to know that boundary. I want to tell you about the afternoon of August 18th, which was the day I understood what I'd actually been recording. I'd ridden out to the fence line as usual. The sun was still an hour from the horizon. The temperature had dropped, not dramatically, but enough to feel like a promise. And there was a movement of air from the north that smelled, if you were reading it carefully, like distant rain. Nora was at the distribution header, checking the pressure gauge. Her daughter was in the south pasture, running a hand over the grass, which was green, not dramatically, not impossibly, not the green of advertisement or fantasy, but green the way things get when they have what they need. Alive green, fighting green, the green of something that has been given a resource it was designed to receive and has responded with everything it had. And across the valley, I could see it from the ridge. The other fields were brown, not dead, droughted, the kind of brown that means we're waiting. The kind of brown that has patience in it, but is running out. I sat on my horse and looked at the Vasquez fields, and then at the valley, and then back again. She looked up from the pressure gauge and saw me looking. "Write it down," she said. "Already am," I said. She looked at the south pasture, where her daughter was still running her hand through the grass, back and forth, like she was petting it. "My grandmother walked this land," Nora said. "Every season. She said the land tells you what it has. You just have to be willing to listen to something that doesn't speak in words." She went back to the pressure gauge. I stayed on the horse a while longer, and I wrote. Not about the fields, not about the water, not about the permits or the board or the Harmon brothers, or the families who came to fill their tanks. I wrote about what it feels like to watch someone who was right for 30 years longer than they were believed, in the person of the woman who carried that rightness forward without being certain she'd ever get to prove it, finally standing at a pressure gauge in a field that is alive when everything around it is dying. Then I wrote, this is not a story about one woman and one field and one aquifer. It's a story about what happens to knowledge when it belongs to people that systems don't trust. And it is still happening. The next chapter is already beginning. The rain came on August 22nd. Not a drought-breaking rain. Not a flood, not a revelation. Just rain, 2.5 inches over 3 days, the kind that soaks in instead of running off, the kind that the valley hadn't seen since April. The creek rose. The irrigation ditch ran at half pressure again. The immediate crisis, the most acute daily drinking water crisis, eased. For most people, this was relief, the thing they'd been waiting for, the return to something like normal. Nora's reaction was different. I know because I went to the fence line the second morning of the rain, because I was in the habit of it, and the habit had become something I thought of as friendship, though I'd never said so. And she was out there despite the rain, checking the cistern, checking the lines, checking the pump casing. You don't have to be out here, I said. It's raining. The cistern needs monitoring when there's surface water, she said. Contamination risk is higher. I need to know if the clay layer is holding. She was checking for the thing that could go wrong, on the day that everything seemed to be going right in the rain. I wrote, standing at the fence in the wet, this is the thing that nobody celebrates, the vigilance after the victory, the knowledge that a thing can be won and then lost if you stop paying attention. She's been paying attention for this her whole life. She won't stop now. Garland's cousin's survey came back negative. The hydrologist called Nora to tell her before she called the cousin. She didn't want Nora to be surprised. There was no perched pocket under the cousin's property, no independent groundwater source. The geological conditions weren't right. Nora told me about this at the fence. I looked for disappointment in her face and didn't find it. I found something more complicated, a kind of acknowledgement that this is how these things work. Not everything has what you're looking for underneath it. The Vasquez property had this, by history and geology and the wisdom of a woman who'd walked this land 60 years ago. The cousin's property didn't. What did you tell the hydrologist? I asked. I told her to write up the survey fully and give it to the cousin, and to note what conditions would have to be present for a perched pocket, so he knows what to look for if he's ever on a different piece of land. She paused. And I told her to keep looking. There's more water in this valley than people think. You just have to be willing to look for it. I wrote, she's not building an operation. She's building a model, something that can be replicated. She's teaching the valley through doing how to read itself. My uncle found me at the barn on August 25th, in the early evening. He stood in the doorway while I was brushing my horse, and he had the look of a man who has made a decision he's been putting off. He said, I want to put in for a survey, the east pasture. The rocky section by the old stock pond. He paused. I know what people will say. I looked at him. I'm 63 years old, he said. I don't have time to wait to be right. I need to start now. I thought about what to say. I thought about Esperanza, who'd said water for 30 years without the equipment to prove it. I thought about Nora at the pressure gauge in a green field. I thought about what it costs to carry knowledge in a body for years before the world makes room for it. I said, I'll set up the survey. He nodded. He turned to go. He stopped. She did a good thing, he said. That Vasquez woman. Yes. She did a good thing and she didn't have to. The water was hers. Yes, I said. He went in. I finished brushing the horse and then I sat in the barn doorway for a long time, in the cooling air after the rain, and I tried to figure out how to write about what the last 3 months had been. What I'd seen. What kind of thing it was. I wrote, what Nora found wasn't just water. Everyone keeps saying that, and it's true, but it's not the whole truth. What she found was a way of holding knowledge, stubborn, private, sustained, across the silence of everyone who could have listened and didn't. Her grandmother held it. Nora carried it. The water waited. 3 generations of women in a straight line, each one trusting the one before her against all available evidence. The cistern is concrete and pipe and a pump and a permit. The real cistern is the one that held the knowledge. I left the valley in early September when my uncle no longer needed the extra hand. He walked me to my truck, shook my hand, and said nothing beyond what was necessary, which was his way. I rode the fence line one last time, early that morning. Nora was already out. She was at the distribution header again, checking pressure, writing something in a small notebook I'd never noticed before. I said, "You're keeping a log." She looked up, looked at the notebook, looked at me. "Started it in June," she said. "Draw volumes, recovery rates, seasonal variation. I want to have data for," she paused. "For whoever comes after." I sat on my horse and looked at the field and then at the photograph of Esperanza that I couldn't see but knew was on the windowsill behind us in the cracked frame, and I thought, this is what it looks like. The continuation of a thing, the handing forward. She said, "You should come back next spring." "Why?" "I'm going to start teaching the survey method, the hydrologist and IA workshop for small operations, so they know how to read the land for themselves." I looked at her for a moment. "I'll come back," I said. "I don't know if I will. I know that I want to. I know that the journal I kept that summer is the most honest thing I've produced in my adult life, and that it was produced in the presence of someone who told me to write down what I actually see, not what sounds right. I'm still working on that." I pulled my horse around and started back toward my uncle's barn. Behind me, I could hear the low hum of the pump through the still morning air, water moving through pipe, underground to surface, rock to root to blade of grass.